The thing hiding in Caleb Mercer's barn wasn't a predator. Predators didn't tremble when someone turned on a light. The wind screamed across the frozen fields of Keeler, nine hard enough to rattle the metal siding of the farmhouse and send loose snow spiraling through the darkness like white ash. Caleb pulled his coat tighter as he crossed the muddy yard, his boots crunching over a thin layer of red ice that had formed after sunset. The old barn stood about 40 yards from the house, its weathered steel roof groaning beneath the storm. Usually the livestock drones shut down automatically after 9 p.m., but one of the motion alarms had started flashing inside his kitchen 10 minutes earlier. Something was moving in there. Probably another wild scavenger trying to escape the cold. Caleb exhaled slowly, watching fog spill from his mouth into the freezing air. 20 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping fast. He grabbed the flashlight hanging near the barn door and slid the old plasma shotgun from his shoulder, more out of habit than concern. Life on the colony frontier taught people to prepare first and ask questions later. The rusty door screeched as he forced it open against the wind. Warm animal musk mixed with damp hay and machine oil rolled out into the night. The barn lights flickered weakly overhead, throwing pale shadows across stacks of feed crates and inactive farming equipment. Caleb stepped inside carefully, boots thudding against the wooden floorboards. "Easy now," he muttered toward the darkness. Not looking for trouble. The motion sensor beeped again somewhere near the back stalls. Then came the sound. Breathing. Fast. Uneven. Human enough to make the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Caleb lifted the flashlight slowly and swept the beam across the barn. Empty feed bins. Rusted hydro tools. Hanging chains swaying gently in the draft. Then the light reached the far corner behind an overturned storage cart. A pair of glowing violet eyes stared back at him. Caleb froze. The figure jerked violently the instant the beam touched her. Not aggressive. Terrified. She pressed herself deeper into the hay, raising both arms instinctively over her head as though expecting a strike before he'd even moved closer. Caleb lowered the shotgun immediately. "Hey," he said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The alien girl looked barely conscious. Her silver-white hair clung to her face in damp strands, and beneath the dirt and frost her skin carried a faint blue sheen that shimmered under the weak barn lights. One side of her loose gray clothing was stained dark around the ribs. Blood, old enough to dry, fresh enough to matter. She tried to push herself backward, but hit the wooden wall behind her. Her breathing quickened harder. Caleb noticed the way she watched his hands instead of his face. Every tiny movement made her shoulders tense. Every shift of his boots made her flinch. Like she'd learned the sound of footsteps meant pain. Something twisted in his chest before he could stop it. "All right," he said softly, crouching down several feet away. "I'll stay right here." The girl didn't answer. Her eyes darted toward the open barn door behind him, calculating distance, escape routes, survival. Caleb knew that look. He'd seen it years ago in refugee camps after the border conflicts ended. People who stopped believing kindness existed usually looked at everyone like a loaded weapon. The storm outside slammed against the barn hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. The alien girl startled violently at the sound, and Caleb saw her bite down on her own sleeve to stop herself from making noise. That hit him harder than the blood. Slowly, very carefully, Caleb set the flashlight on the floor so the beam pointed away from her face. Then he slid the plasma shotgun across the barn boards until it rested near the door instead of beside him. "See," he said, "not here to scare you." Her eyes widened slightly, confused, suspicious, like the idea itself didn't make sense. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small thermal ration bar from dinner earlier that evening. He placed it gently on the hay between them and backed away another step. The girl stared at the food without moving. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen colony like something alive. But inside the barn, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb made the mistake of shifting his weight too quickly. The alien girl recoiled instantly, arms covering her face as panic flashed across her expression so sharply it looked automatic. Not fear. Reflex. Like her body had learned terror long before tonight. Caleb stood perfectly still as the realization settled cold and heavy in his stomach. Whatever had happened to her, it had taught her to fear movement itself. Caleb stayed awake most of the night listening to the storm hammer against the farmhouse windows while the stranger remained hidden inside the barn 40 yards away. Every now and then he caught himself glancing toward the security monitor mounted above the kitchen sink. The grainy black and white feed showed nothing except stacked hay bales and drifting shadows beneath the dim emergency lights. But once around 2 a.m., the camera caught movement. The alien girl carefully crawled out from behind the overturned cart and snatched the thermal ration bar off the floor before retreating again like a frightened animal expecting punishment for eating. Caleb leaned back in his chair and rubbed a tired hand across his jaw. "Good," he muttered quietly to himself. "At least you are still alive." Morning came gray and bitter cold. Ice crystals coated the outside of the farmhouse windows while the old heating vents rattled unevenly through the halls. Caleb pulled on his work jacket and stepped outside with 2 steaming mugs balanced carefully in one hand. Fresh snow crunched beneath his boots as he crossed the yard. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the colony silent beneath a pale red sunrise. Inside the barn, the air smelled faintly of warm machinery and damp straw. The alien girl was exactly where he had left her, except now she sat upright against the wall with both knees pulled tightly against her chest. Her violet eyes snapped toward him the second the door opened. Fear flashed across her face instantly. Not panic this time. Expectation. Caleb noticed something else too. She had not slept. Dark circles shadowed the faint blue skin beneath her eyes, and every muscle in her body looked locked tight from hours of staying alert. Caleb stopped several feet away and slowly lowered one of the mugs onto an empty crate. "Coffee," he said. Then after a short pause, "Well, mostly coffee. Colony beans taste like burned dirt." The girl stared at him without speaking. Caleb sat down on an overturned feed bucket near the entrance, giving her plenty of space. He kept his movements slow, careful, predictable. "Name is Caleb," he said after a while. "This place is mine. Been here almost 8 years now." Silence. Wind rattled softly against the barn walls. Somewhere outside, one of the farming drones powered on with a distant mechanical hum. The girl's eyes flicked constantly between Caleb's face and his hands. He could practically see her calculating danger every second he moved. Finally, after several long minutes, her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Why are you talking to me?" Caleb blinked once. "Because you are in my barn." Most humans report escaped property. The word property settled heavily in the cold air between them. Caleb looked at her more carefully now. Beneath the torn sleeves wrapped around her thin arms, faint metallic bruising circled both wrists. Old restraint marks. His stomach tightened. "Well," he said quietly, "I do not think people are property." The girl's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened slightly around the fabric near her knees. Suspicion. Confusion. Like she had heard the sentence before, but never believed it. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out a small med scanner. "You are hurt," he said. "That side wound needs cleaning." The reaction was immediate. The alien girl recoiled so sharply she nearly hit the wall behind her. Her breathing quickened as terror flooded her face again. Caleb instantly lowered the scanner. "Okay," he said calmly. "Not doing anything. See, I am staying right here." She kept staring at the device like it was a weapon. After several seconds, she whispered something so quietly Caleb almost missed it. "Pain comes before treatment." The sentence hit harder than he expected, not because of what she said, because of how normal she sounded saying it. Like it was simply a rule the universe followed. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose and set the scanner down beside the untouched coffee mug. Then he stood up carefully and backed toward the barn door. "You do not have to trust me," he said. "But nobody here is going to force you into anything." He reached the doorway and paused. "There is soup inside the house when you are hungry." The alien girl looked startled again. Not by the offer, by the fact he was leaving. Caleb stepped out into the freezing morning air and shut the barn door gently behind him. Through the thin metal walls, he could still hear the sound of her breathing. Fast, uneven, waiting for him to come back angry. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped again, and thin sheets of frost crawled across the edges of Caleb's barn windows like veins spreading through glass. The colony weather station kept broadcasting warnings about another cold front rolling in from the northern ridge, but Caleb barely listened anymore. Keeler 9 always sounded like it was trying to kill somebody. He stood at the kitchen counter stirring a pot of vegetable stew while the old radio crackled softly beside him. Static drifted between reports about shipping delays, frozen pipelines, and another missing cargo transport somewhere near the eastern settlements. Outside, the wind had started rising again. Caleb glanced toward the barn through the frosted window above the sink. No movement. No shadows. Still there, though. He knew she was. After a moment, he grabbed a thermal blanket from the hallway closet and filled a small metal tray with food before heading back outside. Snowflakes swirled under the pale security lights as he crossed the yard. This time when he opened the barn door, the alien girl was no longer hiding behind the cart. She stood near one of the support beams instead, tense as wire, watching him carefully from across the room. Caleb noticed immediately that she had moved closer to the exit, closer to escape. Smart. Brought dinner, he said quietly. He crouched near an empty crate and set the tray down without approaching further. The smell of warm broth drifted into the cold air between them. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then the alien girl spoke. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb shrugged lightly. "You looked hungry. Humans do not feed strangers for free." Her voice carried no anger, only certainty, like she was repeating something life had taught her many times. Caleb leaned back against a wooden post and folded his arms loosely. "Maybe the humans you met sucked." The answer seemed to catch her off guard. A faint crease appeared between her pale silver brows before she looked away toward the snow leaking through the cracks in the barn walls. Caleb studied her quietly now that she stood beneath the hanging lights. She looked younger than he first thought, maybe mid-20s by human standards. Thin enough that the oversized gray fabric hanging from her shoulders looked borrowed. One sleeve had slipped slightly, exposing another faded metallic bruise around her wrist. Identification restraint. Transport grade. Caleb recognized the marks from old freight security systems during the war years. His jaw tightened. "You got a name?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated long enough that Caleb figured she would stay silent again. Then finally she whispered, "Lyra." "Lyra," Caleb repeated carefully. "That is a pretty name." Her reaction was immediate. She flinched hard enough that the movement looked painful. Caleb froze. "What?" he asked softly. Lyra stared at him with open suspicion now, shoulders rigid again. "Why would you say that?" Caleb blinked once. "Because it is true." She looked genuinely unsettled by the answer. Not embarrassed. Disturbed. Like compliments carried consequences she already feared. Caleb felt something heavy settle behind his ribs. Every conversation with her felt like stepping around broken glass. One wrong movement, and she expected pain. He slowly pointed toward the tray. "Soup is getting cold." Lyra stared at him for another long moment before cautiously crossing the barn. Her movements stayed small and measured, almost silent against the wooden floorboards. Caleb noticed she never turned her back fully toward him. Even exhausted, part of her remained ready to run. She reached the tray carefully and paused again before touching the spoon. Then her eyes lifted toward him. "What do you want in return?" Caleb almost answered immediately, but something stopped him. Because she was not asking casually. She was terrified of the answer. He looked down at the frost gathering on the toes of his boots before speaking quietly. "Nothing." Lyra's fingers tightened around the spoon. "That is not how people work." Caleb gave a tired half-smile. "Maybe not where you came from." The barn fell silent except for the soft whistle of wind through the roof panels. Lyra lowered her gaze slowly toward the steaming bowl in her hands. Then, for the first time since he found her, Caleb noticed her shoulders loosen by the smallest amount. Not trust, not even close, but maybe exhaustion winning over fear for a few seconds. And somehow that felt even sadder. The barn lights dimmed briefly just after midnight as another wave of freezing wind rolled across the colony plains. Caleb woke instantly at the flicker. Years alone on frontier worlds had trained his body to react to every strange sound before his mind fully caught up. He sat up slowly in bed, listening. The farmhouse heater rattled through the walls. Pipes groaned softly beneath the floorboards. Outside, snow hissed against the windows. Then came the noise. A dull metallic scrape somewhere downstairs. Caleb swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached automatically for the flashlight resting on the nightstand. He checked the security monitor beside the door first. The barn camera showed nothing unusual, but the motion alert inside the house was blinking red. Caleb frowned. He knew he locked the doors before bed. Quietly, he stepped into the hallway, the old wooden floor cold beneath his bare feet. The farmhouse sat almost completely dark except for faint blue lights spilling from the kitchen appliances. Another soft sound echoed from downstairs. Cabinet door. Caleb descended carefully, one hand gripping the flashlight, while the other rested near the utility knife clipped at his belt. By the time he reached the kitchen doorway, he already knew who it was. Lyra stood near the counter, completely frozen in place like a startled deer caught beneath headlights. The refrigerator door hung halfway open behind her, pale light washing across her. Silver hair and thin frame. One of Caleb's old flannel shirts swallowed her almost completely, the sleeves hanging past her hands. She must have taken it from the laundry room. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Lyra's breathing turned shallow the instant she saw him. Caleb noticed immediately how her eyes locked onto the knife at his belt instead of his face. Fear again. Always fear first. Could not sleep. Caleb asked quietly. Lyra hesitated before shaking her head once. The refrigerator hummed softly between them. Caleb glanced toward the counter. Half a loaf of bread sat beside an unopened can of soup and one of the thermal mugs from earlier. She had been trying to make food without waking him. Except she moved through the house, like someone expecting punishment for touching the wrong thing. Caleb slowly stepped toward the stove. "Sit down," he said gently. Lyra stiffened instantly. Caleb stopped moving. "Sorry." He corrected himself after a second. "You can sit down if you want." That seemed to confuse her more than the original command. Carefully, Caleb unclipped the knife from his belt and set it on the counter where she could see it. Then he reached for a pan and began heating soup without another word. The silence stretched softly through the kitchen. Wind rattled the windows while warm light filled the small room. Lyra remained standing near the doorway, tense and uncertain, watching every movement he made. Caleb deliberately kept his motions slow. Open cabinet. Grab spoon. Stir soup. Nothing sudden. Nothing loud. Finally, the smell of heated broth drifted through the kitchen. Caleb poured it into a bowl and placed it carefully on the table before backing away toward the sink. "It is not fancy," he said, "but it is warm." Lyra stared at the bowl for several seconds before approaching cautiously. She sat at the very edge of the chair like she expected to leave at any second. Caleb pretended not to notice. He leaned against the counter instead, arms folded loosely across his chest. "You can stay inside tonight," he said after a while. The spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "Why?" Caleb shrugged lightly. "Because barns are cold. Humans protect things they own." Caleb looked down at the steam rising from his coffee mug. "Lyra," he said quietly, "I am starting to think somebody taught you all the wrong things about people." Her expression shifted slightly at that. Not anger. Something sadder. Older. She lowered her gaze toward the soup again, fingers tightening faintly around the spoon. "No," she whispered after a long silence. "They taught me exactly what people are." The words settled heavily into the kitchen. Caleb did not answer right away. Outside, snow drifted endlessly across the frozen fields beyond the farmhouse windows. Inside, the heater hummed softly while Lyra ate like someone afraid the food might disappear if she slowed down. Caleb watched her carefully without letting it show. Every small thing about her felt wrong in a way he could not explain. The way she listened for footsteps. The way she flinched at kindness harder than anger. The way relief seemed to scare her most of all. Then, as Lyra reached carefully for the thermal mug beside the bowl, her sleeve slipped slightly down her wrist. Caleb saw the faded cereal markings burned into the pale blue skin underneath. Inventory numbers. Not a name. A number. Something cold settled deep in his chest as he realized the truth. Someone had not merely hurt this girl. Someone had erased her until she stopped believing she was a person at all. The next morning arrived quiet and gray beneath a sky heavy with frozen clouds. Caleb stood on the farmhouse porch holding a steaming cup of coffee while the automated sprinklers hissed softly across the hydro fields beyond the barn. Thin mist rose from the rows of nutrient pipes, catching pale red sunlight like smoke drifting across the frozen ground. Usually mornings on Keeler, 9 felt empty to him. Mechanical. Predictable. Wake up. Repair equipment. Ignore the silence. But now every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the farmhouse window behind him, toward the small kitchen where Lyra still sat at the table long after finishing breakfast. She had fallen asleep there sometime before dawn. Caleb noticed it when he came downstairs around 6. Her head rested carefully against folded arms beside the empty soup bowl, silver hair spilling across the tabletop beneath the warm kitchen lights. For a second, He simply stood there watching her breathe. Slow, peaceful, different. She still looked tense even asleep, like part of her body expected danger at any moment. But the exhaustion had finally won. Caleb quietly draped a blanket across her shoulders before stepping outside to start his morning work. Now, nearly an hour later, he returned from checking the generators with snow dusted across his boots and grease smeared along one sleeve. The moment he stepped inside, Lyra jerked awake so violently the chair scraped sharply against the floor. Panic flashed across her face before she fully recognized where she was. Caleb stopped instantly near the doorway. "Easy," he said softly. Lyra's chest rose and fell too quickly. She looked around the kitchen as though trying to reorient herself after years of surviving in unfamiliar rooms. Then her eyes landed on the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Confusion flickered across her face. "You were cold," Caleb explained simply. Lyra touched the edge of the fabric carefully with her fingertips. The gesture looked strangely fragile. "I did not mean to fall asleep here. You do not need permission to sleep." The words left Caleb's mouth naturally, but the reaction they caused made his chest tighten. Lyra lowered her eyes immediately. That is not usually true. Silence settled softly between them. The heater hummed through the walls while wind brushed against the windows outside. Caleb walked slowly toward the counter and grabbed a wrench from beside the sink. "Generator line froze halfway through the night," he muttered casually. "I am going to spend the next 3 hours under a pipe wishing I had chosen a warmer planet." Lyra watched him carefully. "Why tell me that?" Caleb shrugged. "Because people usually talk to each other when they live in the same house." The sentence seemed to catch somewhere inside her. Not visibly, barely even emotionally. But Caleb saw the tiny hesitation in her expression before she looked away again. Like the word live carried a meaning she no longer trusted. He moved carefully around the kitchen, gathering tools into an old metal case. Every motion stayed slow, predictable. He had started noticing himself doing it automatically now. No sudden turns, no loud noises, no reaching near her too quickly. Somewhere along the line, Caleb realized he had adjusted himself around her fear without thinking. As he passed near the table, Lyra suddenly spoke again. "Why are you not asking questions?" Caleb paused. "About what?" "About where I came from. About what happened." He rested the toolbox gently on the floor before answering. "Because you look scared every time somebody asks you for something." Lyra stared at him silently. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Figured maybe you needed a place to breathe before explaining your whole life story." For several long seconds, she said nothing at all. Then quietly, almost too softly to hear, she asked, "What if I am dangerous?" Caleb looked at her fully then. Morning light filtered through the frosted windows behind her, casting pale silver reflections across her blue skin and tired violet eyes. Dangerous was not the word that came to mind when he looked at her. Broken did. Tired did. Lonely definitely did. Caleb gave the smallest shake of his head. "Lyra," he said gently, "you apologized for falling asleep at a kitchen table." Her expression shifted for the briefest moment. Not quite a smile. More like confusion meeting warmth for the first time. Caleb picked up the toolbox again and headed toward the back door. Just before stepping outside, he heard her voice behind him. Quiet. Hesitant. "Caleb." He turned carefully. Lyra looked down at the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. And somehow those two words sounded less like gratitude and more like someone testing whether kindness was real out loud for the first time. 3 days passed before Lyra stopped looking at the windows every time a ship crossed the sky. Caleb noticed because he had started noticing everything about her without meaning to. The way she counted exits whenever she entered a room. The way she paused before accepting food like she expected hidden conditions attached to every kindness. The way silence no longer felt empty when she sat quietly at the kitchen table while he repaired broken circuitry nearby. Outside, winter tightened its grip across Keeler 9. Thick frost coated the hydro fields every morning, and the old generator behind the barn coughed constantly under the strain of non-stop heating cycles. Caleb spent most afternoons buried beneath machinery with frozen fingers and aching shoulders while Lyra remained inside the farmhouse, rarely venturing farther than the porch. But little things had started changing. She no longer slept with the bedroom door fully open. She stopped hiding utensils beneath her sleeves during meals. Once, Caleb even heard soft music coming from the upstairs guest room late at night. Not singing, just humming. quiet and uncertain, like someone remembering what calm sounded like. On the fourth evening, the generator finally failed completely. The house lights flickered twice before darkness swallowed the farmhouse all at once. "Damn it," Caleb muttered from beneath the sink where he had been replacing a water filter. Wind howled outside hard enough to shake the walls. The indoor temperature immediately began dropping. Upstairs, Caleb heard a sudden thud followed by rapid footsteps. Fear. He recognized the sound now. "Lyra," he called carefully while grabbing a flashlight from the counter. "Power is out. That is all." No answer came back. Caleb stepped into the hallway and found her standing near the staircase, frozen beneath the emergency lights glowing dim red along the ceiling. Her breathing looked uneven again. The darkness had triggered something. "Hey," Caleb said softly. "Generator probably froze over." Lyra's eyes darted toward the windows where snow slammed violently against the glass. "How long until heat returns?" "Hour maybe. 2 if the fuel line cracked." Caleb reached for his coat, hanging beside the door. "I will fix it." Lyra looked toward the storm outside, and then back at him. "You are going out there?" Caleb gave a tired half-smile. "I enjoy not becoming an icicle." Usually she would have fallen silent after that. Usually fear pulled her inward whenever situations changed suddenly. But this time, after a strange hesitation, she spoke again. "I can help." Caleb blinked once in surprise. Lyra immediately looked uncertain after saying it, like the offer itself might have been wrong somehow. "You do not have to," Caleb said gently. "I know." Her fingers tightened faintly around the sleeves of the oversized sweater she wore. "I still want to." Something warm flickered unexpectedly through Caleb's chest. Not because she offered help, because it sounded like the first choice she had made freely since arriving here. 20 minutes later, they stood together outside near the generator shed while snow whipped across the frozen yard in violent spirals. Caleb worked on the frozen fuel valve with numb hands while Lyra held the flashlight steady beside him. She stayed close enough for the warmth from his coat to block part of the wind from hitting her directly. "Hand me the thermal wrench," Caleb asked. Lyra immediately stiffened at the request. Caleb noticed the reaction instantly. Her body still associated commands with danger. He softened his voice. "Sorry, could you hand it to me?" The tension in her shoulders eased slightly before she passed him the tool. "You always apologize," she said quietly over the storm. Caleb frowned while tightening the valve. "Should I not?" Lyra watched him carefully through the swirling snow. "People with power usually do not." Caleb let out a soft breath that fogged in the freezing air. "Well," he muttered, "people with power usually suck too." To his surprise, Lyra made a sound then. Small, sudden, a laugh. The noise vanished almost immediately beneath the wind, but Caleb still looked up sharply. Lyra froze the second she realized what happened. Fear flashed across her face again, but different this time. Vulnerable instead of terrified. Like she had accidentally exposed a piece of herself she forgot still existed. Caleb smiled before he could stop himself. "There it is," he said quietly. Lyra stared at him in confusion. "What?" Caleb tightened the last bolt on the fuel line as the generator suddenly roared back to life behind them. Warm light burst across the farmhouse windows. "You," he answered softly. "You sound different when you are not afraid." The storm finally broke 2 days later. Sunlight spilled across the frozen plains of Keeler, 9 in pale golden streaks that reflected off the snow like shattered glass. Caleb had almost forgotten what quiet weather sounded like. The wind no longer screamed against the farmhouse walls. The sky no longer looked bruised and angry above the colony fields. Everything felt strangely still. He stood outside near the barn repairing one of the irrigation drones when he noticed movement near the porch. Lyra had stepped outside alone for the first time since arriving. She paused carefully at the edge of the wooden steps with her hands buried deep inside the oversized brown coat Caleb had given her that morning. The coat hung loosely around her thin frame, the sleeves covering most of her hands, but the thick lining shielded her from the bitter cold rolling across the fields. Caleb tried not to stare, not because she looked strange standing there beneath the winter sunlight, but because she looked fragile in a way that made him instinctively want to protect the moment itself. Lyra tilted her face upward slightly as snow drifted softly through the air around her. The light caught faint silver patterns beneath her blue skin that Caleb had never fully noticed before. Illyrian markings maybe. Natural. Delicate. Like frost spreading beneath glass. You are going to freeze standing there, Caleb called from beside the drone. Lyra looked toward him immediately, startled by the sound of his voice, but the panic faded faster now than it used to. I wanted to see the sky, she answered quietly. Caleb tightened a loose bolt on the irrigation unit before walking toward the porch. Sky has been here the whole time, he muttered. Terrible view if you ask me. To his surprise, Lyra smiled faintly. Small, barely there, but real enough that Caleb felt his chest tighten unexpectedly. They stood together in silence for a while, watching sunlight spill across the frozen hydro fields. Steam drifted from distant heat vents near the generator shed, while the soft mechanical hum of farming drones echoed across the property. It felt peaceful in a way Caleb had not experienced for years. Then, Lyra suddenly stiffened. Caleb noticed instantly. Her eyes locked onto something near the horizon beyond the fields. A cargo shuttle crossed the sky far overhead, nothing more than a dark shape against the clouds. But the moment the engines rumbled faintly through the air, Lyra's breathing changed. Fear returned all at once. Caleb stepped slightly closer without touching her. Hey, he said gently. It is just a freight shuttle. Lyra kept staring at the sky. They use transports like that. Caleb followed her gaze quietly. The coat sleeve shifted slightly as her hands trembled beneath the fabric. You do not have to tell me anything, he said after a moment. I know. Her voice sounded distant now, but sometimes the memories come anyway. Caleb leaned one shoulder against the porch railing beside her. Yeah, he said softly. I know that feeling too. Lyra finally looked at him then. You do? Caleb watched snow swirl across the frozen fields before answering. Lost my younger brother during the border evacuations about 6 years ago. The words came out calm, practiced. Too practiced maybe. Transport failure during a storm. Could not get rescue teams there in time. Silence settled between them again. Lyra studied him carefully, as though realizing for the first time that pain recognized pain even across different species. Caleb rubbed his gloved hands together slowly against the cold. After that, he admitted quietly, I got real good at living alone. Lyra lowered her eyes. And now? Caleb looked toward her without fully meaning to. Wind brushed strands of silver hair gently across her face, while sunlight reflected softly in her violet eyes. For the first time since arriving here, she no longer looked like someone trying to disappear. Just someone tired of running. Caleb gave a small shrug. Now my house has somebody stealing all the soup. Lyra blinked once in surprise. Then another quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. This time she did not look ashamed afterward. She just stood there beneath the pale winter sunlight, holding his coat tightly around herself, while the sound faded into the cold air between them. And for the first time since, Caleb found her hiding in his barn. The farmhouse no longer felt empty. The sound woke Caleb a little after midnight. Not a scream, not footsteps, just glass rattling softly somewhere downstairs, followed by the unmistakable hiss of an incoming transmission signal. His eyes opened instantly in the darkness. Years on frontier colonies trained people to recognize danger by sound alone. Caleb sat upright and listened carefully. The house heater hummed through the walls. Wind scraped gently across the roof. Then the signal sounded again. 3 sharp pulses from the old communications console near the kitchen. Caleb threw on his flannel shirt and headed downstairs. Halfway down the staircase, he stopped cold. Lyra already stood in the kitchen near the counter, frozen completely still beneath the dim overhead lights. Her face had gone pale beneath the faint blue glow of her skin. The old transmission console mounted against the wall blinked red across the room. Incoming request. External channel. Unregistered frequency. Caleb moved carefully into the kitchen. You expecting somebody? He asked quietly. Lyra did not answer. Her eyes remained locked on the console like it might explode. Another pulse echoed through the room. Caleb frowned and stepped toward the terminal. Could just be freight control. The second his hand reached toward the screen, Lyra's voice cut through the silence sharp enough to stop him immediately. Do not answer that. Caleb looked back at her. Fear radiated from every inch of her body now. Worse than before. Worse than the first night in the barn. Lyra, he said carefully, what is going on? She swallowed hard before finally speaking. They found me. The words settled like ice through the kitchen. Caleb stared at her for several long seconds while the transmission signal continued pulsing steadily behind him. Outside, Snow drifted quietly across the dark colony fields beyond the windows. Everything suddenly felt too still. "Who found you?" Caleb asked. Lyra wrapped her arms tightly around herself beneath the oversized sweater she wore. "The people who own me." Caleb felt something cold tighten behind his ribs. He glanced toward the console. Again, the blinking red light reflected faintly across the kitchen walls. "How?" Lyra lowered her eyes. "Tracking markers." Caleb's expression hardened slightly. "In your restraints?" She gave a small nod. "Most transport inventory carries biological tags beneath the skin." "Inventory, not person. Inventory." Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose while years of buried anger stirred unpleasantly inside his chest. "Can you remove it?" Lyra shook her head immediately. "Only surgical scanners can isolate the signal." The transmission beeped again, longer this time. Caleb crossed the kitchen and shut the console off completely. Silence rushed back into the farmhouse at once. Lyra looked startled by the gesture. "That will not stop them," she whispered. Caleb leaned against the counter, jaw tight beneath the kitchen lights. "Maybe not, but I am not letting strangers ping my house at 1 a.m. Lyra stared at him in disbelief. "You do not understand." Her breathing had quickened again. "They do not stop searching. They do not negotiate. If they know I am here." She stopped suddenly. Caleb noticed her hands trembling now. Not fear for herself this time. Fear for him. "Hey," he said gently. "Look at me." Lyra hesitated before lifting her eyes toward him. "You are not responsible for what happens to this place," Caleb said quietly. "You hear me? But they will hurt you." Caleb gave a tired breath through his nose. "Lyra, this colony already charges me 1,200 credits a month for frozen plumbing. I have survived worse." To his surprise, she almost smiled despite the fear. Almost. But it vanished quickly beneath guilt. "I should leave before sunrise," she whispered. Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then he walked past her toward the mudroom near the back door. Lyra looked confused until she heard the sound of heavy metal locks sliding into place. Caleb returned a second later, holding the old barn keys in one hand. Without a word, he placed them gently into Lyra's palm. "Caleb, if anybody comes here," he said quietly, "they do not get inside unless you choose it." Lyra looked down at the keys resting in her trembling hand like she did not understand what she was seeing. "Why would you trust me with this?" Caleb met her eyes steadily. "Because somebody should." Silence filled the kitchen again. Warm light spilled softly across the wooden floor while snow drifted endlessly beyond the windows. Lyra stared down at the keys for several long seconds before curling her fingers around them carefully, like she was holding something far more dangerous than metal. Something fragile. Something unfamiliar. Trust. Caleb barely slept after the transmission. Every few hours, he found himself staring through the farmhouse windows toward the frozen fields beyond the barn, half expecting lights to appear across the snow at any moment. But dawn arrived quietly. Pale sunlight spilled over the horizon in soft red bands while frost coated the old fence posts surrounding the property. The world looked peaceful enough to lie about danger. Inside the farmhouse, the silence felt heavier than usual. Lyra stayed upstairs most of the morning. Caleb could hear faint movement above him now and then, slow footsteps crossing the guest room floor, but she did not come down for breakfast. Around noon, he finally found her sitting alone near the upstairs window with her knees pulled tightly against her chest. Snow drifted lazily outside while cold light filled the room around her. She looked small there somehow, smaller than when he first found her in the barn. Fear had changed shape inside her. Before, she feared everyone. Now she feared losing the one place where she finally felt safe. Caleb leaned gently against the doorway. "You planning on surviving entirely on tea and anxiety today?" Lyra glanced toward him, startled at first before recognizing his voice. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I did not mean to hide." Caleb shrugged lightly and stepped inside. "You are allowed to be scared, Lyra." Her fingers tightened faintly around the blanket draped across her lap. "That is the problem." Caleb frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" For several seconds, she said nothing. Then finally her voice came soft and distant. "Before this place, fear was useful. Fear kept me alert. Fear kept me alive." She lowered her eyes toward the snowfall outside the window. "Now I keep forgetting to be afraid." Something about the confession hit Caleb harder than he expected. He crossed the room slowly and sat down in the old chair near the heater vent. giving her space while the warm air hummed quietly between them. "That sounds exhausting," he said gently. Lyra let out a faint breath that almost resembled a laugh. "You make safety sound normal." Caleb rubbed one hand along the back of his neck. "Maybe it should be." Silence settled softly through the room. Somewhere downstairs, the old farmhouse pipes groaned beneath the cold while wind brushed gently across the roof. Then Lyra suddenly spoke again. "When I first arrived here," she hesitated, "I thought you were waiting." Caleb looked up at her carefully. "Waiting for what?" Her violet eyes lowered toward her hands. "For me to owe you something." The words hung painfully in the quiet room. Caleb felt his chest tighten as pieces finally clicked together in ways he wished they had not. Every meal she questioned. Every kindness she distrusted. Every apology for existing. Somewhere along the line, people had taught her that safety always came with a price. Caleb leaned forward slowly, forearms resting against his knees. "Lyra," he said quietly, "look at me." She hesitated before lifting her eyes toward him. "You do not owe me anything." Her expression tightened immediately, not because she disagreed, but because she wanted to believe him too badly. Caleb could see it now. The war happening silently behind her eyes every time kindness touched her life. "That is difficult to understand," she admitted softly. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah, I figured." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then suddenly the farmhouse security alarm beeped sharply downstairs. Both of them froze instantly. Caleb stood at once, while Lyra's entire body went rigid with fear. Another beep echoed through the house. Perimeter motion sensor. Southfield. Caleb crossed quickly toward the window and looked out over the frozen property below. A vehicle sat parked near the outer fence line beyond the hydro fields. Black transport model. Unmarked. His jaw tightened immediately. Lyra had already gone pale behind him. "They found me," she whispered. Caleb watched the distant vehicle carefully. No movement yet. Just waiting. Watching. Snow drifted slowly around the dark silhouette beneath the gray afternoon sky. Then Caleb did something Lyra clearly did not expect. He reached beside the doorframe, grabbed his heavy winter coat, and tossed it gently toward her. "Put that on," he said calmly. Lyra caught the coat against her chest, confusion flashing across her face through the fear. "Why?" Caleb opened the hallway closet and reached for the old plasma rifle locked inside. "Because," he answered quietly while checking the charge cell, "nobody gets to walk onto my property and make you afraid again." The black transport remained motionless beyond the outer fence while snow drifted silently around it beneath the gray afternoon sky. Caleb stood near the farmhouse window watching for movement through the blowing frost. Nothing. No engines revving. No figures approaching. Just patience. Somehow that felt worse. Behind him, Lyra clutched the heavy winter coat tightly around herself while fear hollowed the color from her face. Caleb checked the charge indicator on the old plasma rifle and frowned at the weak reading. 32%. Frontier life. "Caleb," Lyra whispered carefully, "you should let me go." He did not look away from the window. "No, you do not understand what they are." Caleb finally turned toward her then. "I understand enough." He crossed the room and grabbed another thermal battery from the supply drawer near the kitchen. People who track someone across 3 systems usually are not trying to hand out apology cards. Lyra's expression tightened painfully. "They will not stop." Caleb slid the battery into the rifle with a metallic click. "Neither will I." For a second, she looked almost angry hearing that. Not because she disagreed. Because nobody had ever chosen her over their own safety before. Caleb noticed the conflict behind her eyes immediately. Fear pulling one direction, hope pulling the other. The security alarm beeped again. Closer this time. Motion near the south gate. Caleb stepped carefully toward the porch window and saw 2 figures now moving. Through the snow beyond the fence line. Dark coats. Slow pace. Deliberate. One of them carried a scanning device, glowing faint blue beneath the storm clouds. Lyra's breathing turned shallow beside him. They found the tracker. Caleb lowered the window shade halfway. "Then we stopped broadcasting it." He turned toward the hallway closet and pulled out an old emergency med kit from the top shelf. Lyra stared at him in confusion. "What are you doing?" Caleb unzipped the kit quickly and removed a handheld surgical scanner wrapped in faded plastic. "Bought this thing after I sliced my arm open repairing a grain rotor 2 winters ago." He held it up toward her carefully. "You said the tracker is under your skin?" Lyra immediately took a step backward. Fear flashed across her face at the sight of medical equipment. Caleb softened his voice instantly. "Hey, look at me." Her eyes lifted toward him slowly. "I am not going to do anything you do not want." Lyra's chest rose unevenly beneath the coat. Outside, faint crunching footsteps echoed across the frozen yard. "Closer now." Caleb lowered the scanner. "But if we leave that tracker active," he said gently, "they will keep finding you no matter where you run." Silence stretched painfully between them. Then Lyra gave the smallest nod. Caleb exhaled softly. "Okay." He guided her carefully toward the kitchen chair near the heater vent. Every movement stayed slow, predictable. He noticed her hands trembling as she sat down. "Where is it located?" he asked quietly. Lyra hesitated before carefully pulling back the sweater collar near her shoulder. A faint silver scar rested beneath the pale blue skin just above her collarbone. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. Implant site. Small enough to miss unless someone knew what to look for. He crouched beside the chair while powering on the scanner. Soft blue light filled the kitchen. Lyra immediately stiffened. Caleb noticed at once. "Breathe," he said gently. "You are okay." She closed her eyes tightly anyway. Caleb worked carefully, guiding the scanner across the scar while the device hummed softly in his hands. Outside, wind rattled the farmhouse walls. Somewhere beyond the snow-covered fields, voices echoed faintly near the gate. Time was running thin. The scanner beeped suddenly. "Signal located." Caleb frowned at the display. "Tiny little thing," he muttered. "No bigger than a grain chip." Lyra's breathing quickened as Caleb reached for the extraction tool inside the med kit. "Wait," she whispered suddenly. Caleb stopped instantly. Her eyes remained closed as fear rolled visibly through her body. "Nobody ever asked before," she admitted softly. The words hit him harder than he expected. Caleb lowered the extraction tool slightly. "Lyra." She opened her eyes slowly toward him. "I need you to know something." Snow hissed against the windows while distant footsteps crunched closer outside the farmhouse. Caleb met her frightened gaze steadily beneath the warm kitchen lights. "If you tell me to stop," he said quietly, "I stop." For several long seconds, she simply stared at him, like her mind could not fully process the sentence. Then finally, with trembling fingers clutching the edge of Caleb's coat around her shoulders, Lyra whispered the one thing nobody had ever given her before. "Okay." The extraction tool trembled slightly in Caleb's hand, not because he was afraid of the procedure, but because Lyra was still shaking beneath the kitchen lights. Outside, footsteps crunched slowly through the snow near the south fence while the wind carried faint voices across the frozen fields. Time pressed against the farmhouse walls like another storm moving closer. Caleb kept his voice low and steady. "You are doing fine." Lyra sat rigid in the chair, fingers clenched tightly around the sleeves of Caleb's coat wrapped across her lap. Her breathing came shallow but controlled now, not because the fear disappeared, because she was trying to trust him through it. Caleb switched the extraction tool on. A soft blue glow illuminated the small scar near her collarbone. The moment the device touched her skin, Lyra flinched sharply. Caleb immediately pulled back. "Sorry." Lyra shook her head quickly despite the fear. "No, keep going." Caleb studied her face carefully before continuing. Slow movements, gentle pressure. The tool hummed softly as it isolated the tiny, metallic implant beneath the surface of her skin. Sweat gathered faintly along Lyra's brow despite the cold farmhouse air. Caleb could practically feel how hard she fought not to panic. "Almost there," he murmured. Outside, a bright flashlight beam suddenly swept across the front windows downstairs. Lyra's entire body locked instantly. Caleb glanced toward the dark hallway. Voices echoed faintly outside now. "Closer." "Caleb," Lyra whispered fearfully. "Do not stop," he answered quietly. The extraction tool beeped once. Then a tiny metallic object slipped free into Caleb's palm no larger than a grain of rice. The scanner immediately went silent. Signal terminated. Lyra exhaled sharply like someone surfacing from underwater after holding their breath too long. Caleb dropped the tracker into a metal coffee mug beside the sink and covered it quickly with a dish towel. "There," he said gently. "They cannot track you anymore." Lyra stared at him in disbelief. Not relief yet. She did not know how to trust relief. Then suddenly the front door alarm sounded downstairs. 3 loud warning chimes echoed through the farmhouse. Someone had reached the porch. Caleb stood immediately, grabbing the plasma rifle from beside the counter. "Stay upstairs," he said firmly. Lyra rose from the chair at once. "No." Caleb looked toward her sharply. Fear remained in her eyes, but something else stood beside it now. Resolve. "If they are here for me," she said quietly, "then I do not hide while you face them alone." Caleb opened his mouth to argue before stopping himself. Weeks ago she would have curled into silence. Weeks ago she would have run. But now she stood beside him despite trembling hands and visible fear, because somewhere along the line, survival stopped being the only thing that mattered to her. Another knock echoed heavily through the farmhouse below. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose. "Stay behind me then." Together they descended the staircase into the dim first floor. Snow rattled softly against the windows while the porch alarm blinked red near the entryway. Caleb approached carefully and checked the exterior monitor mounted beside the door. Two figures stood outside. Beneath the blowing snow, wearing dark thermal coats with insignia patches hidden beneath layers of ice. One stepped closer toward the camera. Alien. Gray-skinned. Cold expression. Human resident. The distorted voice crackled through the speaker system. "We are conducting retrieval operations for stolen Illyrian property. Cooperate and compensation will be provided." Property. Caleb felt anger rise instantly beneath his ribs. Behind him, Lyra went pale again hearing the word. Caleb pressed the intercom calmly. "Funny thing," he said evenly. "The person you are looking for lives here." Silence followed for half a second. Then the voice returned colder than before. "Stand aside, human." Caleb looked briefly over his shoulder toward Lyra. She stood near the bottom of the staircase, clutching Caleb's coat tightly around herself. Fear visible in every breath she took. But she was still standing there, still fighting the instinct to disappear. Caleb turned back toward the door. "No," he answered simply. Another pause followed outside. Then the alien voice lowered slightly. "You do not understand what she is." Caleb's grip tightened around the rifle resting safely at his side. "Yeah," he said quietly while warm farmhouse lights spilled across the frozen porch outside. "That is where you are wrong." He glanced once more toward Lyra standing behind him. Not property, not inventory, just scared, just healing, just human enough to matter. Caleb faced the door again as snow drifted endlessly across the dark fields beyond the farmhouse. "I think I finally understand exactly who she is." For several long seconds, nothing moved outside the farmhouse except falling snow. The two figures remained standing beneath the porch lights while cold wind swept across the frozen fields behind them. Caleb kept one hand steady on the plasma rifle at his side, not raised, not threatening, just ready. Behind him, Lyra stood completely silent near the staircase. He could hear her breathing. Fast, uneven, but she had not stepped back. The intercom crackled again. "Human," the gray-skinned figure said calmly. "You are interfering in authorized retrieval operations under interstellar commerce law." Caleb stared through the frosted glass at the dark silhouettes beyond the door. "Funny," he answered evenly. "Pretty sure slavery stopped being legal where decent people live." The figure outside showed no reaction. The Illyrian female carries registered ownership markers. Caleb glanced briefly toward the kitchen where the destroyed tracker still sat hidden beneath the dish towel. Not anymore. Silence followed. Then the second figure stepped slightly forward through the snow. Taller, broader shoulders. Something about the posture made Caleb tense instinctively. Military maybe, or private security. Either way, trained. "You misunderstand her value." The voice outside continued. "She is not a civilian labor unit." Caleb frowned slightly. Behind him, Lyra lowered her eyes toward the floor. Fear changed shape across her expression again. Not just terror now. Shame. The sight of it made something inside Caleb harden. "Then explain it to me," he said coldly. The wind howled softly around the farmhouse. Then finally the first figure answered. Subject designation Lyra Vale is the daughter of Illyrian diplomat Seraphine Vale. Missing for 6 years following transport interception near the outer meridian routes. Caleb felt the room go completely still around him. Behind him, Lyra closed her eyes briefly like hearing the words physically hurt. "That is impossible," Caleb said quietly. "You called her property 5 minutes ago. Because she was sold through black market channels before recovery efforts identified her." The alien voice remained emotionless. "Our employers intend to return her alive." Caleb turned slowly toward Lyra then. She looked smaller somehow, standing near the staircase beneath the dim farmhouse lights. Not because she was weak, because years of being treated like an object had erased every trace of the person she used to be. "Lyra?" he asked carefully. Her eyes finally lifted toward his, full of fear, full of exhaustion. "I did not remember," she whispered. "Not at first." Caleb lowered the rifle slightly. "You are telling me your family has been searching for you this whole time?" Lyra swallowed hard. "I remember pieces now. After the tracker was removed." Her voice trembled faintly. "My mother's voice. Diplomatic chambers. Music." She looked down at her shaking hands. "Before they took me." Outside, the intercom crackled once more. "Our transport can verify her genetic identity immediately." Caleb stayed silent for several long seconds. Snow tapped softly against the farmhouse windows while warm air drifted through the heater vents. Everything suddenly felt fragile. Then Lyra spoke again, quieter this time. "If I go with them," Caleb looked at her instantly. Fear lingered in her expression, but not the same fear from before. This fear hurt differently. "I do not know who I am anymore," she admitted softly. The sentence struck harder than any threat outside the farmhouse ever could. Caleb understood then. The problem was never simply escaping captivity. It was surviving long enough afterward to remember you deserved freedom in the first place. Slowly, Caleb set the plasma rifle down against the wall beside the doorway. Lyra looked startled by the gesture. "Caleb," he stepped closer carefully, giving her enough space to retreat if she needed it. She did not move. "Listen to me," he said gently. "Whatever those people stole from you," his voice softened further, "they did not erase all of it." Lyra's eyes shimmered beneath the warm kitchen lights. Caleb reached slowly into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out the small brass barn key she had returned to the counter earlier that morning. He placed it carefully into her trembling hand again. "You know why?" he asked quietly. Lyra stared down at the key resting in her palm. Snow drifted endlessly outside the farmhouse windows while silence filled the space between them. Caleb gave the smallest tired smile. "Because scared people do not usually learn how to trust again," he said softly. "But you did." For a moment, Lyra simply stood there staring at the brass key in her hand like it weighed more than metal ever should. Then finally, slowly, the fear in her expression cracked just enough for something else to shine through. Not panic, not survival, recognition. Like after years of being treated like property, somebody had finally handed her proof she was still a person. Spring arrived slowly on Keeler 9. Snow still clung stubbornly to the far hills beyond Caleb's property, but the frozen ground around the farmhouse had finally begun to thaw beneath pale golden sunlight. Water dripped steadily from the barn roof during the afternoons, forming small muddy rivers through the fields where frost used to rain for months at a time. Caleb stood near the fence line tightening a loose support cable while the soft hum of irrigation drones drifted across the warming air. Somewhere behind him, he heard the farmhouse door open. He smiled before turning around. Lyra stepped carefully onto the porch wrapped in the same brown coat Caleb had first given her during the winter storms. Except now she wore it differently. Not like armor, just comfort. Her silver hair moved gently in the wind, while warm sunlight reflected softly against the faint patterns beneath her blue skin. Caleb still noticed the small things sometimes. The way sudden noises made her shoulders tense for half a second before relaxing again. The way she paused before entering crowded places whenever supply ships visited the neighboring settlements. Healing, he had learned, was not dramatic. It happened quietly, one safe moment at a time. Lyra walked slowly down the porch steps, carrying 2 steaming mugs in her hands. "Coffee," she announced softly, "or what humans insist on calling coffee." Caleb laughed under his breath while accepting the mug from her. "Careful. That joke means you officially live here now." To his surprise, Lyra smiled easily this time. No hesitation, no fear afterward. The sight still caught him off guard sometimes. 3 months had passed since the retrieval agents arrived at the farmhouse. 3 months since the Illyrian Diplomatic Council confirmed Lyra's identity through genetic records and transport archives. Caleb remembered expecting everything to change after that. He assumed ships would arrive, officials, ceremonies, maybe even pressure to return immediately to the life stolen from her years ago. Instead, the first thing Lyra's mother did after contacting her through secure transmission was cry. Not political speeches, not legal demands, just tears. Caleb had quietly stepped out of the room during that conversation, but he still remembered hearing Lyra's voice break for the first time afterward. Not from fear, from being loved loudly enough to reach across 6 lost years. The Illyrian Council offered her transport home within days. She refused twice before finally agreeing to visit temporarily the following month. Caleb remembered standing awkwardly beside the barn while the diplomatic shuttle prepared for departure. He had expected goodbye to hurt less somehow. Frontier life taught people not to hold on to things too tightly. But watching Lyra hesitate beside the shuttle ramp with fear and uncertainty written across her face had nearly broken him in ways he did not fully understand. Then she surprised him. "Will the barn still be here when I come back?" she asked quietly that morning. Caleb stared at her for several seconds before answering. "Yeah," he said softly, "long as I am around." Lyra looked down at the brass key resting in her hand before closing her fingers around it carefully. "Good," she whispered, "because I think part of me stayed here." She returned 6 weeks later, not because she had nowhere else to go anymore, but because for the first time in years, she finally had somewhere she wanted to be. Now she stood beside Caleb beneath the warming spring sunlight, while steam curled gently from their coffee mugs into the cool morning air. The farmhouse behind them no longer felt lonely. The silence no longer felt empty. Lyra leaned carefully against the wooden fence beside him, shoulder brushing softly against the sleeve of his work jacket. Small contact, casual, but Caleb still noticed how she no longer flinched when he moved near her. In the distance, wind rolled gently through the thawing fields beneath the sky, finally turning blue again after months of winter storms. Lyra watched the horizon quietly before speaking. "Do you know something strange?" Caleb glanced toward her. "Always." She smiled faintly. "I used to think fear kept people alive." Caleb sipped his coffee while waiting. Lyra looked out across the fields glowing gold beneath the morning sun. "But it was kindness," she whispered softly. "That was the thing I almost forgot how to survive without." Caleb said nothing after that. He just stood beside her in the quiet spring air while sunlight spilled warmly across the farmhouse, the barn, and the frozen world that no longer felt cold enough to break them apart. And somewhere deep inside the silence between them, 2 damaged people finally stopped waiting for pain to follow every moment of peace.